We demystify what goes on behind the therapy room door. Join us on this voyage of discovery and co-creative conversations. This is the Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast, with Bob Cook and Jacci Jones.
Welcome back to this next episode, and because we were trying to shut Bob up in the last episode, we're doing contracting part 2 in this episode because there's a lot to cover.
Yes, there is. Eric Berne, the originator of transactional analysis. And remember, at heart, I'm a transactional analyst. I trained in transactional analysis for the last 20 years. I also trained in integrative psychotherapy, but that's based on a personality model of transactional analysis. So TA is in my heart. And Eric Berne, the originator of TA, it was a firm advocate of contracts, as I am. And he called a contract a specific bilateral agreement towards a specific outcome, or some definition like that. But the words I really like is bilateral. Contract is between two people.
Yes.
So you don't just go to therapy and say to therapists, oh, I just like to look at why I'm depressed, and the therapist says yes, and that's the contract. You know, there needs to be more of exploration, more of a bilateral process where there's encouragement towards autonomy. So you get more specificity about contracts. So I'm a great fan of contracts, but I wanted to talk about different types of contracts, such as process contracts and sessional contracts. And then I wanted to talk about disadvantages of contracting from other psychotherapy modalities perspectives.
Yeah, I'm interested in this because I only know about transactional analysis.
Okay, well, let's just talk about process and sessional contracts. Yeah. Okay, so I talked earlier on about what happens when you come to a session and you have the administrative contract, but then you talk about what's going to be the treatment goals, and we talked about that.
Yes.
And then we talked about how you might accept an exploring contract to look at the sabotage mechanisms, or you might go for a harder contract, which is quite specific if it's to do with, say, I don't know, eating disorders and goals about that, which can be quite specific. So you can just go for specific behaviorable, observable contracts. But most therapists, I think, will accept exploring contracts to look at the sabotage mechanisms and come back and make contracts. That's what we were talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just talk about sessional contracts and process contracts. So as you go along in the therapeutic process, you will often, many therapists have what they call sessional contracts, as when somebody comes in and says, continues in the therapy, let's say on about depression. Yeah, so the overall contract is to be content and have zest for life rather than being depressed, right?
Yeah.
However, as they go along, they come to the realization with their therapist that their critical self is at conflict with another part of the self, so they are very hard on themselves. Yeah, and that means that the younger part of themselves feels depressed and they incapacitate themselves. That's what they've discovered. So by the 6th or 7th session, they now start looking at how they can desensitize the critical part of themselves so they can become kinder to themselves instead of being critical, so they have more energy to get out of bed.
Yeah.
So that could be a sessional contract where you are actually exploring the conflict of the two parts of the self, the critical part and the younger or adaptive part of the self. So that's a sessional contract.
As in the session? As
in the session. Absolutely right, Jacci.
Yeah.
That's why it's called sessional. So you have that as well. You must do sessional contracts.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. But it might run over more than one session. It's not like, right, you've got 50 minutes. We'll
Oh, is that why you said that? Yeah, okay. Okay, I see what you mean. Yes, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying that, okay, somebody starts talking to their father or the critical part of themselves, and we stop after 50 minutes to achieve that. No, I understand what you're saying now. So even though I think there's a sessional contract and you might have sessional homework, then we may review that, or it might go on a bit more into the next 2 or 3 sessions. So you're correct, the sessional contract may extend into other sessions, but it's different from the overall contract.
Yes, yeah, that's the long-term aim, but then it's how we get to that could mean that there's 5 or 6 different things within it. Yeah,
and in it you might give sessional homework.
Yes, yeah.
So for example, you might say, right, when you go home tonight, I would like you to give yourself some affirmations, or start doing homework which is related to desensitizing the critical part of yourself.
Yeah.
So it links into the overall contract, but it's what we would call sessional contracts, or even what some people will call process contracts, which comes out of the work session by session.
Yes, yeah. Do you give homework then?
Yes, sometimes I do. Yes, I'm somebody who probably is. Am I known for that? I'm not sure, but I do give homework. But let's put another name on it. I did say homework, but I pull myself up when I say that, because really what I mean is I'm giving, we'll say work. I don't like the work homework really. I would say, let's just call it work for the moment, where people go back in the other 7 days between the session, where they may do some exercises to actually start integrating what they've learned in the previous session.
Yes.
So for example, if there's somebody who's hard on themselves and we've worked out in the session that really, even though they don't feel it, they're acting just like their father talked to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I might give some work for them to do in between the session, where they start looking at how they can be kind to themselves in a different way, utterly different way than how their father parented them, for example. This is just an example. But I might ask them to look at how they can integrate parts of themselves which are less toxic to the people they're having relationships with, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
They practice it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can call it homework, but it's a bit, I don't really know, like that way, because it's a bit transferential, or we're going back.
But it is, it's work that they're doing at home in between the sessions.
Yeah. So yes, I do give quite a bit, and sometimes I ask them to write journals.
I was just about to say that's just something that I often do outside of the session, is get them to start journaling things that, just notice, things in between the week, because I think it's quite a good idea as well for people, if they have an insight or if there's something that happens during the week, make a note of it and then you can bring it back in the next session. Because sometimes they come into the session and they're like blank. They've forgotten the previous one and what's happened in the week. And
without doubt. So a client, you work with a client and they start saying, oh, I've started to realize since the last session how I overburden myself, how I actually feel so overwhelmed that I am unable to do things. And you know what? I've started to realize for the first time that how many people's expectations I take on, how many emotional burdens I have in my pressure cooker, and how I feel like I'm just want to collapse. But it comes from all these expectations that people have of me, and I want to change that.
Yeah.
So what I ask them to do is go away and write down and think about and reflect upon all the expectations that people have put on you and what you do to cope.
Yeah.
And bring it back next week.
Which is brilliant, because once you've had the insight, then you become aware of it. Once it's in your awareness, then you can make a decision whether you want to change it or not, and then you can do the work on it, get to the nitty-gritty. Yeah. So
if somebody's paying you £60 a week, I think I don't mind putting some homework exercises in.
Yeah. And again, if you are journaling, if there is some sort of journal, then it's good to reflect on it. That's something else that I do in the sessions is, let's look back over the last 4 months and see, how things have changed.
Absolutely. I'm 70 now, Jackie, and I went into therapy for myself when I was 35. Now,
half your life, Bob.
My life, but from the age of 21 to the age of 33, I kept diaries.
Wow.
right? And they were big Collins diaries. They're the big ones.
Yeah.
And they have huge long pages for each day. So before I knew about journaling, before I knew about psychotherapy, I kept, and I've got them up here somewhere in the office, 14 or 15 years of diaries, right? And they were diaries, and the purpose of those diaries, and I didn't go to the therapist to ever learn this, was basically cathartic.
Yeah.
To unburden the pain in my own heart.
Yeah.
In fact, to such extent, I don't even look at them now. And went to therapy, and did a lot of things. And I stopped writing diaries, I think, as I got started to get better. But actually, I now talk to my own clients when I was working about journals. And the journals often came from a healthy perspective rather than the perspective I'm talking about. Having said that, how cathartic it was.
Yeah.
It was a way that I could cope. So journals, these sort of diaries we're talking about, provide often such a cathartic expression of our own soul.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know at the Institute as well, there's lots of videos connected with the website and everything that I don't know how you would feel about pointing a client to watching a video on a certain topic so that they have a certain amount of understanding.
Yes, wonderful. There's a term for this. I'm a great advocate of this. Educative therapy.
Good, because I love that. Yeah.
Educative therapy is a really important part of enabling a good person to take ownership, not only of knowledge they didn't know,
Yeah,
but also parts of their own histories emotionally they didn't know.
yeah. Which again, would you say that links into the autonomy where, they're taking responsibility for the sessions and the progression and everything? Yeah.
Definitely. There is one really important caveat though, that as a therapist, I always ask at the beginning of the therapy this. I check out in terms of their support mechanisms. Because you see, doing all this alone in your own flat with no support isn't that healthy.
No.
Well, I'm not saying it isn't healthy, because I think catharsism, as I've talked about, is healthy. But I advocate in the therapeutic work, people gaining, and enlarging their own world. So they've got, people who they can perhaps talk to a little bit.
Yes.
Or because when we're alone, we're often left with our own fantasies, and our own fantasies can actually sometimes be positive, but also can continue the process of unhealthiness.
Yeah. That's a really valid point. Yeah. So, do you want to go on and talk about some of the negative points?
Oh yes, let's just talk about disadvantages of contracting. Now, I'm not talking about the administrative contracts here. Yeah. I'm talking about psychological contracts, where we're talking about goals and outcomes and getting a way forward, right? Yeah. So some disciplines, and I was thinking of Gestalt psychotherapy here, which is a psychotherapy which is all about helping people not only stay in the here and now, but be aware of their different parts of the self in the here and now. So Gestalt psychotherapists wouldn't particularly believe in contracts, because they might say, for example, that, if you make a contract, it could be very focus driven and the real, or task driven, and the real self, which needs healing, goes underground, and you never actually meet that part of the self that needs healing. You meet this adapted part of the self, which is task driven.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm thinking that even in transactional analysis, there are, certain personality traits that contracting fits well with, and some where it doesn't.
Well, just think of antisocial.
Yeah.
So somebody who's antisocial, they may well comply and adapt to the contract that's made, but actually you never really meet the part that actually needs healing because of the antisocial character.
Yeah.
So there are different, personality styles that I think contracting doesn't lend itself to, for example.
Yeah.
And it's true, a lot of clients may well adapt. This is why I said to you right at the beginning, the contracts, as much as you can get them, need to be adult to adult.
Yes.
But of course, they may appear adult to adult, but in fact, they may be from a person's compliant part of themselves or their adaptive part of themselves, and you actually never really reach the part of themselves that's underneath the contract.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do we do then? Do we go through the motions? Why do we go through the motions?
Well, I haven't got a Gestalt therapist here. A good friend of mine is, but they might agree, disagree with me. They do have some. They like the terms focuses of awareness. In other words, we might look at depression, but they're more interested in interruptions to contact, and they're more interested in how a person doesn't keep themselves in the here and now. Because if a person's depressed, or if they are, I'll pick depressed because it's the most common one, or they are riddled with anxiety, that means they're not able to stay in the here and now.
Yeah.
They will go to the different parts of the self.
Yeah.
And that's where the Gestalt therapy, those are things that Gestalt therapist is interested in, because they believe in contact more than anything else. And they believe in focuses of awareness, they're calling that. I mean, if we take person-centered counseling, for example, now I was thinking about this because I know I talk about contracting, and they do believe in contracts. However, I think much more contracts which are led by the client rather than perhaps a bilateral contract.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think contracts need to be bilateral because I want to encourage autonomy, and I want to encourage less infantilization, and I want to encourage a place where we're both coming from adult, at least at the beginning. So in other words, I am quite happy about being quite directive in the terms of bilateralism anyway.
Yeah.
To get a contract at the beginning. And the other side of all this, of course, is the more disturbed somebody is, the more unable that they are really to stay in their adult or their here and now, the age they are, to make a contract.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're making it often from a regressed place. Now, therefore, the question is, does the therapist then accept a contract from a regressed place? I don't think they should. And as I said, I think with disturbed people, we need to first of all think about whether psychotherapy is suitable for them.
Yeah. Which takes us right back to the early podcast where we were talking about having enough adult capacity to be in therapy. Yeah.
So, but there is a real argument against psychological contracts in any particular specific or hard way, because you might then have a task-driven type of therapy rather than looking at what's underneath it.
Yeah.
I'm just shutting this door. So there is that to think about with contracts.
Yeah. And task-driven might suit some clients.
It might suit them. They might come in and say, really what I want to do is lose £10 in weight. Yes, so absolutely. For brief task-driven contracts, I'm not against them particularly. Yeah. But I think that my life was being a long-term psychotherapist, looking at the different conflicts between the multiple parts of the self, and therefore my contracts were much more exploring, even though I did have an adult contract at the beginning.
Yeah. But I'm thinking, if somebody wanted to go on holiday in the summer and they had a fear of flying, that they might want to just specifically talk about that. Or if, I don't know, they've got a medical procedure coming up and they're frightened of hospitals, I just want to focus on this for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever.
Yeah, so you could have a task, you could have a contract which is more suited to brief psychotherapy, quite task driven, and not go into what I would think is probably the internal parts of the self, which is criticizing the other parts of the self, for example. So yes, you're quite right. You could keep it in a much more what I would call CBT.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I'm not opposed to that. So it's good that you mentioned that, because a lot of that type of therapy, you often have what I would call hard contracts, which is specific, observable, behavioural, and you talk about how long it'd take to finish it.
Yeah. But you could theoretically have a hard contract within a normal contract that, we're going to, plan to see each other for quite a while. But for the first 6 weeks, I want to focus on this because it's quite imminent, and it's, I need to sort this out before I can do anything else.
That's right, Jackie. So that gives the space for what you said a long time ago about reviewing.
Yeah.
So you review, and the contracts can change, and you might get process contracts or sessional contracts, or review the overall contract in a much more fluid, integrative way.
Yes.
Which is how I like to see contract making.
Yes, me too. Because I think when talking about a contract, what I always think is it's quite fixed. We sign on the dotted line and it's fixed. And once you've signed a contract, you signing it in blood, and it's going to be that way forevermore. But it's not. It's not the case.
Not with psychological contracts. I don't ask, and I never have. I don't know about you, but I've never asked a client to sign a psychological contract.
No. It wouldn't be worth anything if they did, because it all depends on where they are in the moment that they're signing it. In my mind, it's like I when I was a foster carer, we used to have these, psychological things that we had to fill out. And I refused to do it. I used to get into trouble quite a lot because it all depended what sort of a day they had. And this was going in their file that would probably follow them around for the rest of their life on my interpretation of the behaviour in a given moment. And I didn't think that was fair.
No, I agree with you. I would probably done the same.
Yeah, so it's, sometimes being a human being is like trying to catch water. We think that's what we want to do, but then it changes. It
often really does change, and that's why I think flexibility within the therapeutic process around contracting.
Yeah. And, going back to the earlier sessions that, the podcasts that we've done, I think that's why I like the co-creating, that, the client is as responsible as us to redefine the contract. If it's not going the way that you want as a client, then say something, bring it up with the therapist in a session. Don't just go along with it if it's not what you want to be doing.
That's completely right. And of course, a lot of clients are so young. So young, they feel they haven't got the power to do that. However, if you have this type of transparent conversation at the beginning, and if you have bilateralism and autonomy as one of the goals, then at least we can explore how come somebody feels they can't have a sense of autonomy in the sessions. Because if they've made you their idealized parent, or they've made you the person in charge of their health and change, then we have a lopsided contract, don't we? Now, you might have an overall contract, as I say, XXXX, and as you explore it, you might go through stages where it's really important to have what I would call, an idealized transference as we go along. But I don't think that, put it another way, I think that both of you need to keep in your mind very intensely what the overall contract is, even though you might go to different places to achieve that contract.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because you've got to have, it's kind of like a map to a certain extent, of where the treasure is. We need to have some sort of a focus, even if we veer off every now and then. We need to come back back on the main route, if that makes sense somehow. Yeah.
So it's important, and I brought that in about the disadvantage of contracts. Sometimes we might never see the real self if we are so pre-designed or pre-focused on achieving the task. It's an important thing to think about, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's really important just to touch on before we finish that different modalities, some people don't have contracts in any shape or form whatsoever. You know, when I was doing NLP training quite a few years ago, and they didn't believe in any sort of contracting.
Because
they just didn't see that there was a need for it.
I
I really struggled with that because my transactional analysis training said it is vitally important for both parties. But they're like, no, I don't take any details. I don't even need to know their address or anything. As long as I've got the billing details, that's it.
Well, now we're going to money, perhaps, but no, I think that I don't like that at all.
I didn't fit.
The power dynamics sound very fishy there.
Yeah, it just didn't fit right with me at all.
I believe in goals, transparency, autonomy as the major focuses here. And I think that if you are going to set out on a journey and it's only the therapist that knows the way, then I think that's a healthy journey that you will go on.
Yeah. And for any of the listeners, I'm not saying that every NLP, therapist practices in this way, but the one that I was doing the training under, that's what was said, that you don't need to keep any notes, you don't need to have any contracting or anything. Somebody can just go for a session.
Well, we know that's unethical.
And that's it.
We know that's unethical. You have to keep notes.
Yeah.
So we know all the administrative part. I don't know how to get away what that's all about. But I also think for psychological treatment that if you're the only person who knows the direction that you're going in, I think there's a certain unhealthiness there.
Yeah. So
we're getting around to be a contract fan, are we?
Well, I've had one. I just follow the rules of the Manchester Institute. I was told I need one, and that's what I do. And
but those are the reasons for them, I hope.
Yeah, 100%.
It's not just there for just because we just come up with that. No, I think autonomy, bilateralism, transparency, they're very important.
Yeah,
very important concepts.
Yeah, and I do like the comfort and the structure around a contract for both parties, that like I said, we can have a goal in mind, a short term, a long term, and we can discuss it. And it's really important to me that the client feels able to do that.
We're back again, aren't we, to autonomy?
Yeah.
Co-created relationships.
Yeah.
Transparency. They're words which are very, very important in the therapeutic dialogue.
Yeah. Because again, that Father Christmas thing that you mentioned earlier on, a lot of people come in with that, and it's kind of like, well, no, it's not all my responsibility. This is a conversation that we have. You have your own insights. The hope is that we discuss something, you go out, you sort of the process seeps in during the week, you come back with go a deeper level, and that's how it works. It's not just 50 minutes of your week where you are looking inwardly. It kind of happens all through the week.
Yeah, that gives a sense of accountability. And the other thing, very briefly, I hope we've got a couple of minutes just to say, is that in the therapeutic process, actually sometimes these contracts may not be achieved.
Yeah.
You may have a contract between of you to whatever it is, to be more content, more whatever happy means, or less depressed, or whatever contracts we make. We may explore that, and we may get so far, so the person's less depressed, they can get out of bed, they can take care of themselves, they can function, and that might be enough for them. So we don't always achieve those contracts, but at least we have, I think, transparent goals and outcomes which you can measure the effectiveness of therapy by.
Yeah. Which again, I think is really important. It needs, we need to look at how effective things are. Yeah.
And I think research would back this up as well.
Yeah.
The importance of having visions, having goals.
Yeah.
Be able to look at the effectiveness of the change, I think is vitally important. And people will feel much more empowered by the effectiveness of that process.
Yeah. And again, it kind of shows that they're invested in the recovery. Well, I don't know whether recovery is the right word, but
recovery is a good word.
That they are actually invested in the therapeutic process rather than just being told to do something and going and doing it.
Absolutely. And then they might say, right, I've achieved this, we've achieved our contract, we know where we are, I've done enough therapy and I'll come back or not come back, but at least, and then they'll thank me, hopefully I'll get some thanks, and that'll be a phase of their life and they'll move on.
Yeah. And you will have done a wonderful job, Bob.
Well, I hope we will have done a wonderful job together, because contracts need to be bilateral. I'm ending on that, hopefully, because contracts cannot be unitary. Otherwise, they're just made by the person. In other words, the power dynamics are all wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like a business. Well, I don't know. I was going to say it's kind of like a business contract, but even those you've got, both parties have got to agree to them.
Yeah, they've both got to agree. I charge £60, and can you pay for that? Yes. Hey, so it's here. It's an hour a week. Yes, it's at the Manchester Institute or wherever it's in your house, wherever it is.
Yeah.
And I don't work with people who are drunk, and I don't work with people XXX, and there's confidentiality, and there's a framework, there's a structure. You know where you are, I know where we are, and if those get breached in some way, then we can look at that.
Yeah. So do you know what we're covering in the next session, Bob?
No, but I do know we touch contracts. I mean, so I'd like to discuss what I was thinking of doing today, but we had 2 podcasts on contract, which I've really enjoyed. Treatment planning.
Okay.
In other words,
planning.
Yeah. So, for example, certain therapists will have a model for working with depression. There are books on how you work with depression. Some people have models and treatment plans for working with people who've got eating disorders. Some therapists will have models and treatment plans which are specific for working with sexual abuse. Some therapists will have treatment plans which are specific for working with trauma. So therapists, hopefully, if they're trained and experienced, will have ways of looking at how you work with particular issues that come along, and they're often called treatment plans in the actual training lexicon. So I'd like to talk about that.
That's wonderful. Yes. Yeah.
Because this is right at the beginning. We haven't really got into how we do it yet.
Yeah.
But this is the sort of beginning bit, contracts and treatment plannings. We can talk about what happens later.
Yes.
But if somebody comes specifically with an eating disorder, then hopefully the psychotherapist you see will have an idea. You might not want to call them treatment plan, by the way. You might just want to call it model, but it'd be interesting to talk about.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like we're on the path coming in. We're still at the early stages, but it's opening the door to what goes on in the therapy room. Yeah.
But to have a structure, an idea. If you go to a therapist, for example, on somebody got an eating disorder, bulimia, anorexia, for example, or other aspects of eating disorders, you wouldn't go to a therapist who hadn't got an idea or a model of how to work in that particular area, would you?
No. And if you'd got somebody walking through the door and you didn't have that skill set, then in my mind, ethically, it would be referring them on to somebody that did. Yeah.
So it's a big subject area, but I'll enjoy the next opportunity to talk about that with you.
We might do it in one, or we might have to spread it over 2, depending on how it goes. Thank you so much, Bob, and I will see you in the next episode.
Yes, you will. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
You've been listening to The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode.